The purpose of levying a tax, is to get the non-government sector to come and offer themselves to you to work to get the money they need to pay the taxes. So why would any government then deliberately levy taxes to create unemployment so that people come to them to look for a job and then not employ them? I mean, it's crazy.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just wanted to jump in here to let you know in July in Leeds, the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies are hosting the first UK Modern Monetary Theory Conference. It features Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, L. Randall Ray, Pavlina Chernova, Scott Fulweiler, Dirk Entz, and others to be announced. It takes place from the 15th to the 17th of July. Tickets are limited and selling fast, so don't miss out. There are quite a few other events coming up this year, including the 4th International European MMT Conference in Berlin, starting on the 31st of August, and the Edward Lipinski Foundation's highly recommended MMT Summer School in Poznan, Poland, starting on the 27th of August. And so I've linked to all of the above and every other event I'm aware of in the show notes to this episode, along with links to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. This is part 2 of a 2-part conversation, and you can find a link to part 1 in the show notes. Thanks as ever for your support and for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. So we've gone down a number of avenues here, Phil, and just to recap the different methodologies you're talking about in the paper, in terms of the methodology behind MMT, you write, and this is your personal view, but MMT's approach to money is a form of retroduction within an open systems ontology. I love all of those words. What is retroduction? What is an open systems ontology?
So I'd contrast retroduction with deduction, and a deductive methodology, which is employed by the Austrians particularly, and also neoclassicists. They start with what they consider to be self-evident truths or axioms, that people act, that it's rational for people to act so as to maximize utility, because why would not doing that would not be rational. So you can't study social science if you don't have these assumptions of rationality. So from these deductive starting points, they will then build models, and these models then will produce predictions, and then they will go away in principle. Now, I'm going to hold that thing in principle. They would check those predictions against reality. And if, generally speaking, there's a match between the predictions of the model and reality, they would hold that theory or that approach, which is based on that methodology, with some degree of confidence. Now, obviously, they are in principle opening themselves up to falsification. So if there's a weight of evidence that contradicts the predictions of the theory, at least in principle, they should start looking for alternatives. Now, obviously, I could talk a lot about that, but one might argue that, in fact, the neoclassical economists didn't actually do that. Now, the Austrians are a little bit different in as much as they don't take exactly the same approach as the neoclassical economists. They think that, in a way, their models are insulated against, their methodology insulates their theories against empirical falsification. So what they're saying is their approach is that people act and this is self-evident, they maximise utility. And really what would happen is it's a matter of trying to understand the world in the light of that which is true by definition. Now, to me, that's not a methodology I favour, and it's called praxeology, and there's various forms of praxeology, and the Austrians would refine it, but essentially for them, their theory is not subject to falsification in the same way as, at least in principle, the neoclassicists are. What I would say about the neoclassicists is, and I think we've talked about this before, is after the crisis, although they did say they faced falsifiability, they didn't actually do that. They just sort of tried to fix their models and put sticking plasters on them. In contrast to that, I argue, now not everybody in MMT is particularly focused on methodology or agrees with this idea of retroduction, so I would like to put that as a marker down. There might be people say, well, I'm an MMT and I don't agree with that, or I've never heard of that. But for me, what MMT is consistent with is totally different approach. What happens is people observe the world, what's happening in the world, and they ask themselves a question. What must the world, or what do I think the world is like for me to see what I see? So it's like a depth reality. So it's saying, what do I imagine in my mind are the mechanisms that are at play beneath what I can actually see?
This goes to a little bit to your work with Jamie Morgan, where the idea is like, how do you put it? Things that stand out in the flux of what reality?
Flux of experience, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So a classic example might be, say, for example, all the mainstream economists, and your listener will be familiar with it, if the government runs very large deficits, it will drive the interest rate up. Now, we'd heard this from politicians constantly. If we borrow too much money, the interest rate will go up, and that's very bad for the economy moving forward. Large deficits mean that interest rates on government debt will go up. And this was constantly in the news. Now, when we had the financial crisis and we were in fear of deep recession, maybe even depression, obviously the governments got together and maybe prevented the worst of it in extremis. What happened was, of course, long-term interest rates went down, and not just like in one country, in every single country, major country of the world that's got its own currency. I'm not talking the euro. They all went down. Now, if you were looking at that, you would think to yourself, well, whoa, that's something.
That is standing out in the flux of experience.
Indeed, it's in a big way.
Yeah.
So what I would argue, then you've got to say to yourself, well, what do I think underneath the surface of reality? Because retroduction is found in honesty a depth reality. In simple terms, there are mechanisms which, if you like, are at the deepest level, and the mechanisms cause events, and that's in a thing called the intransitive domain for those listeners who are interested in that sort of thing. And these events are then perceived by scientists in the transitive domain. And that obviously they make mistakes, they build models, they do all this scientific activity to understand these events they perceive. But all three of those things are distinct. So there's a depth to the world. Now, what I would argue is that somebody like Warren, for example, is retroducing, whether he knows it or not. Maybe he'd agree, maybe he wouldn't. So I'm saying that Warren can see the interest rate going down, not up. And then he's thinking to himself, well, why does that happen? Now, he probably did that about 30 years ago. And his insights enabled him to make a lot of money for his customers. So he'd be thinking, well, what are the mechanisms at play then in the markets that mean that when we had big deficits, the interest rate went down, not up? Well, first of all, he's going to reject the sort of loanable funds theory. And those of you who studied economics, more demand for a fixed pot of savings means that the government's borrowing, the demand curve moves to the right and up goes the interest rates. He's ignoring all that because it has no bearing on reality.
let's just drill into that just for a second. I'll say it back to you and you tell me whether I got it right enough for the casual listener. So obviously when MMT, as we say, when the government spends, new purchasing power, new pounds in the UK are added to the private sector's or the non-government sector's balance sheet, rather than that the government has to borrow pounds from the private sector, therefore shrinking a pool of money that just pre-exists, shrinking that pool of available pounds for the private sector to borrow and invest. So the government's quote unquote borrowing, which if you've been listening to this podcast for a long time, is not really borrowing, that it's just a vestige of the gold standard that the government has to issue bonds, but to issue bonds to match its anticipated deficit. But what we're saying is that the government spending adds to ceteris paribus, adds to the private sector's balance sheet, and rather than taking away from the private sector's capacity to invest.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So the man in the street or the neoclassical economist might think, well, if the government's borrowing more, then there's more demand for borrowing, and that'll drive up the price that you have to pay to borrow. It's like, and it has a certain sort of simple connection with your mind, and therefore it's quite an intuitive idea.
What you have to believe in order to believe that, though, is that there is a pool of money that always existed. And it didn't come from anywhere. It just always existed. And it's at this fixed level. And therefore, anybody, whether it's the government or the non-government, borrowing out of that pool shrinks the available pounds left over. But that very first step about believing in a pre-existing pool of real pounds that just kind of existed in nature. I know that I'm making it sound like I'm talking about this with derision, but it really must be what you think in order to believe the loanable funds theory.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. If you say you're an Austrian school economist, now, I don't pretend to be an expert in the subtlety of Austrian economics. And also it's a big school and they have disagreements with each other on matters of subtlety. So I'm not in any way, I'll put that just in case an Austrian school economist does happen to listen to this podcast. Like, well, he's not got that quite right. But in essence, this is what the Austrian schools are thinking. They think, and we've talked about it a bit, many years ago, people were exchanging. And then they decided that it didn't quite work efficiently, so you needed a cost-saving alternative to barter, some medium of exchange which was just more saleable or more acceptable because everybody else would accept it. And this is a spontaneous market-driven process. And for them, money is a medium of exchange. If you say what it is, it's a medium of exchange. It's a thing. It's a commodity. For them, money is a creature of commodities. And so for them, you would imagine if you think of it as a thing, a commodity in of itself, normal market things, like we have demand and supply, I know you've been studying demand and supply. If in your head, you're, if you like, conceptualizing money as a thing, it will have like a supply and demand curve for it. And when there's more demand for the thing, the price of the thing will go up, i.e. the interest rate. And so the loanable funds is perfectly consistent with the method and the methodology used by the Austrian school. It absolutely fits, because that's, now once you say, well, no, money's got a different ontology to that. Money is ontologically speaking an IOU, and with the thing, the money thing, as Keynes called it, is just a signifier. The money itself is simply a debt denominated in a unit of account. Once you conceptualize money like that, you see that an IOU has to be issued before it can be collected, which fits in with what you just said, Christian, because the government spends by crediting accounts. In other words, it goes into debt by issuing its debt, which is a credit to the holder. So the loanable funds is simply not applicable, built on the methodology that I'm talking about. And then sort of going back to the point about the retroduction would be, for someone like Warren, he would think, well, okay, if the government is spending a lot more net of tax, that will leave an excess of bank reserves in the system, which will tend to drive the interest rate down to zero unless no action was taken. Now, Warren knows that mechanism is there, so he understands the mechanism, he's perceived it in his head, and he recognises that that causes events. The event is excess reserves drives the interest rate to zero. So for Warren, massive state deficits, there would be no surprise at all that the interest rate would naturally, the overnight rate would fall to zero. And on top of that, he knows, of course, being in the markets, the mechanisms, that the long-term interest rate is just the expectation of all the shorter-term interest rates. And if you're in deep recession, these guys who've got the power, obviously the government ceded the power to these primary dealers, they all expect interest rates to go down, and they are under the control of the central bankers. And they think, what do we think the central bankers will do? Well, we're going to approach a recession. Interest rates are going to be very low. So their auction bids for long-term debt will reflect that expectation. So that's retroduction in a nutshell. It's something did stand out in the flux of experience in a big way. And Warren understood the mechanism. He understood the events that would follow. And he understood why it was happening. And that's why, if you then go back to the mainstream or the Austrians, all these guys, they've got to come up with what fancy term is ad hoc explanations. Oh, well, this, that, and the other. But they're fighting a losing battle because they've been defeated and categorically falsified, in my opinion. But they won't move over, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, let's come back to this persistence of debunked paradigms in a minute. But just before we move on to that, on the methodology again, the second part of your sentence was open systems ontology. Have we been through that? What do we mean by that?
Well, an open system is where lots of factors are happening at once. Now, one way to avoid the problem of open systems for a natural scientist is to carry out controlled experiments. So you might say, okay, in the actual physical world, loads of factors are happening at once. Now, I'm not a philosopher of science, but I mean, nobody really knows every single factor. But a good scientist and a team of scientists might have a pretty good idea of nearly all the factors affecting a particular event, like a plant growing. There's loads of things that affect its growth, light, pH, soil temperature, all these things. And if they were going to do an experiment, say, what's the effect of light on photosynthesis, they would hold all the factors constant apart from light on two groups of plants and repeat it. So they'd be pretty confident, wouldn't they, that they'd isolated one factor. So in other words, they'd made an artificial closed system that takes the other things out. And then they make the metaphysical assumption that the things that work, now they've isolated the mechanism, that mechanism is still working, if you like, in the actual world, even though its effect might be masked by other factors. So we know that light then encourages photosynthesis, and if maybe plants that have got plenty of light are still not doing very well, they think, well, maybe I haven't watered them enough or something. But in economics, unfortunately, we cannot hold all the other factors constant. So what then happens is that you have to say, well, do we think that the conditions of a model is such that we can statistically isolate something, or the area we're looking at is close enough, and I believe that's quite vague, to be a closed system, so we can do things like econometrics and things. Now, there are kind of, I guess, three views of econometrics, and I'm sort of simplifying a bit, but firstly, the sort of mainstream view that you've got to have econometrics in every PhD paper, so you've got to do loads of mathematics. You've got to imagine the system is close enough to a closed system, so we're just going to do it. It's all very meaningful. Then there's the other extreme, which is saying, because the world is so open, so many things changing once, you can't really do this sort of rigorous econometric modelling. So forget it. And the other view of econometrics is, well, okay, in many cases, it isn't applicable because there's so many factors at once, but there may be cases where a skilled economist could use econometric model because the things they're analysing is close enough to close to make it justified. And also the idea of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because if you don't agree with that mathematical modelling based on all these abstract assumptions, that does not mean that you shouldn't be very, very much in looking at data, analysing data, trying to work out what's happening with data. Because going back to the retroduction thing, if you accept that the world we see is open, lots of factors are changing. However, even in a world where everything's changing, some things really stand out, which comes back to this phrase, stands out in the flux of experience. So that was a whack you in the face moment, the fact that massive government deficits in 2008, 9, whatever, interest rates all dropped massive. That's a big thing. So what you've still got to do then is think, well, okay, let's look what's happening. So you need to do a lot of data analysis. You need to look at what's happening to interest rates. You need to find a chronology of events to support your theory, like big deficits not driving up rates. So I would argue retroduction MMT is very consistent with the use of mathematical techniques and data analysis. It's not consistent, though, with like this ubiquitous abstract modelling of econometrics. You know what I mean? That's the difference. So with the deductivists, they say, right, let's make some assumptions, let's build a model and hope it works and the world's closed enough for it to work. Don't agree with that. I think you look at the world, when things stand out, only clever people can do it, by the way. It's not retroduction. I don't want you to think it's easy. People can't go out and go, oh, I've just retroduced a system. You might argue maybe did Copernicus do that? I think maybe he did. So these people can see things that are counterintuitive. And that's the genius. The genius is more like Warren. He could look at things that were happening and understand the mechanism. And I asked Randy Ray once, what I probably mentioned before, give me something Warren said that was nobody said before. And he goes, well, he saw bond sales as a reserve drain. Because he understood the mechanisms, he'd reproduce in his head, he just saw it. And he knew that's what it was. Nobody else knew that. So it's difficult to do that. But I'm arguing that's what MMTs do. I admit I'm not the only one, but I'm probably not in the majority. And really, you know, if the listeners have a think about what I'm saying, that they might agree, they might not. But that's the difference. I reject this ubiquitous doing mathematical modelling all the time, because most of the time it doesn't apply. I wouldn't boot it out altogether. And I do certainly support the use of mathematical statistics to rigorously check your theories and approaches, which have come originally from retroduction.
So this allows us to get a little bit more specific with one of Per Byland's critiques of MMT. And he writes, in the scholarly literature, interest in MMT is limited. Okay, that's debatable. But then he goes on to say, one reason for this is likely that MMT focuses on policy prescriptions rather than explanations, which makes it unsuitable for research. Now, I know that I think you've already responded to that at length, but is there anything more to say?
Well, it's difficult to know because obviously I've not met Per Byland. He seems quite pleasant. I've had an odd Twitter message. I'm not adversarial to individuals on the ideas. Now, to be fair to him, he's an Austrian school economist. His job is to write about Austrian school economics. Fine. He knows much more about Austrian school economics than me. But the problem really is that sometimes people will say things like interest in MMT is limited. Well, it might be limited in the world he operates in, but not the world he doesn't. And this idea, it mainly talks about policy. Well, that's because whenever he's read about it, and people like him, the Austrians, it's what really their main source of inspiration, if you like, and information about MMT, is when there'll be some sort of op-ed or something in a financial paper about MMT advocating for bigger deficits or a job guarantee or something which expands the government. So from Austrian perspectives, that's what MMT is. Now, you could then argue, well, shouldn't Austrian school economists find a darkened room and spend about 6 months actually reading Warren's work, reading Bill's work, reading Randy's work? In an ideal world, yes. Are they going to do that? No, because for them it's a waste of time. Because for them, MMT is just yet another advocacy for the big state. So for them, their heckles go up straight away. And because they see the world so differently, they see the world as, I think I mentioned earlier in the interview, they see the world, they confuse this is and ought. They think the smaller the government, the better things would be. And that's in their heart. It's their hardcore, as Lakatos and other philosophers said. And any sort of policies they pick up in financial papers which might suggest the government could and should do more is anathema to them. So my real thing is that they just haven't gone that deep. Per Bannerman's seen probably quite a lot of literature which is about policies that come out of MMT, and he and the Austrians have not really dug into the theory deep enough.
Yeah, and like you say, it's understandable why that happens. And to be fair to Byland, he is, rather than referencing tweets, he's referencing Ray and people like that. But I think on this question about normative and descriptive, it's often debated whether MMT is descriptive or prescriptive. And I think you answer that question perfectly, actually, in a way, in your paper by saying MMT begins from observation of how a money system works in order to make claims about how it could work if properly understood. I think that's all that we need to say about why there is a descriptive and prescriptive part to MMT. So if I can draw you into this, so we observe that new money, new purchasing power comes into the private sector when the government net spends more than it collects in taxes. It adds to non-government sector's balance sheet. And then we have the MMT money story about how this came about, why people accept the government's IOUs as money, why everything becomes for sale in pounds in the UK, dollars in the US, and on. But then there's so all this given, the chartalist explanation of taxes driving currency and the observation of, I guess, sectoral balances, what happens on both sides of the balance sheet between the public and the private sector when the government spends and taxes. Then we come into this idea, so if you understand this is how it works, and when we've done it through, as you've said, through retroduction, we've noted those things that stand out in the flux of experience. We've had some ideas about what might be going on at the deep level of reality. We've tested them. Warren's definitely tested them, put his money and his clients' money on the line in terms of Italian bonds back in the day. And so it's been tested. And there we go. Now it's understood. This is how it works. Now we move on to the prescriptive part of MMT, and it's the job guarantee. And this is, I've thrown you in at the deep end, but, why do we advocate for the job guarantee? Not in terms of, obviously, it's going to be better for everybody in the economy if we don't have a huge buffer stock, millions of unemployed people, this buffer stock of people expanding and contracting in order to target some imaginary NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, this fictional thing that nobody can actually put a number on. Outside of that, why is it the case that a job guarantee is the prescriptive part of MMT?
I think if you start from the basics of MMT, and if you think, what causes unemployment in the first place? And that's the existence of a tax liability. So initially, you have the tax liability. Now, before that, there is no unemployment, because unemployment is defined as seeking work paid in the state's currency. So before the state has issued currency, there isn't any unemployment. People are just living on the land, operating in subsistence, or whatever situation, tribal society there is before unemployment. So the MMT money story starts from, there's a tax liability, So people have to pay the tax. So they have to seek employment paid in the state's money to pay the tax. And if they can't find any employment, strangely enough, they're unemployed. So by definition, then, the purpose of tax, levying a tax, is to get the non-government sector to come and offer themselves to you to work, to get the money they need to pay the taxes. So why would any government then deliberately levy taxes to create unemployment so that people come to them to look for a job and then not employ them? I mean, it's crazy. So as MMT says, a level of unemployment above whatever basically above zero in terms of the demand for labour and supply for labour being equal, etc. So the existence of unemployment is de facto evidence that taxes or net spending is too low. That's the thing, that the job guarantee falls naturally from the existence of a tax liability. It would be insane to create unemployment with a tax and then just leave people idle doing nothing.
Yeah, it's dysfunctional, which kind of goes to the functional finance. Like, okay, what would be a functional way to run this system? That, okay, you personally, Mr. Central Bank, Mr. Head of the Treasury, didn't design, but the system was designed to do this. So what would be a functional way to run it? Well, full employment, of course. We didn't institute this system in order to have people not be able to earn the means to feed themselves and house themselves. We ran this system in order to provision some hopefully democratically derived public purpose.
Yeah, I mean, say, for example, in a simple world, say you were doing a lot of singing, Christian, and you were very successful. And I decided, because I was the government, I wanted you to come and sing for me instead of doing a load of singing out in the community. So I said, okay, well, you need to pay me 100 quid every week, and I'll pay you 100 quid if you come and sing for me. And then you came to me to do the singing, and I go, no, I don't want you now. Clear off. You still have to pay me the 100 quid, but you can't get it from me. And you go, but what? I was doing all right. Now that effectively is what the government's doing. To put a tax on, so tax reduces non-government spending. You free up all the resources they could then use to do the things we need. And that's, now we can't afford to employ them. I know we've got all this unemployed people. People want to be nurses, doctors. We want people to go and work in schools. But now we decided we're not going to do it. Now, they don't put it that way. They put it in the wrong way. But when you think about it, there are other good things about the job guarantee, of course, like the idea that it's a buffer stock, and like all buffer stocks, it's a price anchor. So if you've got a buffer stock of workers who are skilled and working, they're not losing their skills or suffering from hysteresis for the economists out there, the pool gets bigger when there's a recession and shrinks in a boom. But everyone's always got the opportunity to contribute. And then in a boom, of course, firms don't have to compete for people who are already employed because they're all unemployed people if there was no stocks. So they can just get people out of the buffer stock with a relatively small wage rise or better conditions.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. Can I just emphasize something? Because you brought up buffer stocks. Again, what we're saying, or what MMT is saying, is that the way that floating exchange rate currencies that we have around the world, UK, US, Japan, Canada, Australia, the way it works is the government has no choice, the issuer has no choice but to choose a buffer stock, whether they know it or not, and it's probably arguably the case that they don't. And a gold standard is a gold buffer stock. So they have to have the gold reserves to maintain a certain price level between gold and the dollar, let's say. And other people have said, I'm thinking about Scott Fulwiler and others, said the wool price stabilization scheme in Australia that comes up a lot when people talk about the work of Bill Mitchell, is that's a wool buffer stock. And Bill Mitchell himself has said, look, we're ensuring full employment of wool with this buffer stock. Well, the next thing you move to, if you think, well, maybe people are more important than wool, is, well, let's have a full employment of people then. If we have to pick a buffer stock, instead of having gold and wool, let's do people.
Yeah. They obviously have chosen a buffer stock of unemployed people currently around the world.
Yeah. Okay. And if you're going to do the people buffer stock, what should the people experiencing being in that buffer stock be entitled to? And I know people don't like the word entitled and entitlement, but I just think human rights are there, So
I think it's important to distinguish, because sometimes this, and you will come across this, Christian, the distinguish between the first point, which is that if taxes cause unemployment for the purpose of the government provisioning itself, if you're not using the resources that you've just taken away from the private sector by putting a tax liability on, it would be insane, and it goes against every logical way. So that's your number one point. The buffer stock mechanism is another point. And then the other thing which is entirely separate of that is about people, about the goods of life, goods of work that people get through work, the esteem. And that's a very important element to advocacy of a job guarantee. But that's separate in a way. The first point is the critical point, where it's just a logical outcrop of the theory. So it doesn't make any sense whatsoever for the government just to leave people unemployed, having made them unemployed. And the rest, of course, not plugging my daughter's paper, but she's very interested in the sort of the goods of work and the benefits of the job guarantee in terms of what it brings to people. And her paper, I think, is a complement to the other aspects that are on the GIM site about what the job guarantee does in terms of being a buffer stock and absorbing the labour that taxes have caused. So they're all important, and they're complementary aspects which are distinct from each other, I would say.
So, just to get back to Byland's arguments, he also writes, and we have discussed this previously, but if the currency is valued and only because it is needed to pay the taxes owed to the government, this doesn't explain why actors would value it much beyond their tax liabilities. Again, we've already gone over it, but just to recap, Byland's mistake in that line is the words, in my opinion, and only because. Right? Our response, I think, to that misinterpretation is to point out, no, there's this thing called the net savings desires of the private sector.
Yeah, this would have been fair to him. If you look at his world, and he's not here to defend himself, but let's say he is, I'm trying to be him, he would say, okay, let's go back to what we just said. People act, they act in self-interest, they're trying to maximise utility, so these individuals have been bartering, this is slow, it doesn't work very well, so they replace it with a thing, an object, a commodity, which is a medium of exchange and a unit of account all in one. And they're all using this money. It's nothing to do with the state. All right, the state's later. So along comes the state later, the bad guy, the bogeyman. And again, the Austrians see the state, because they believe people always act in their self-interest. If you've got a group of people, the state, they'll act in their interest, not everybody else's interest. So it all fits in with their deep-lying philosophy. So it's all consistent and it's neat. I'll give them that. So obviously, so you imagine a world where everyone's swapping their gold coins that they've invented with each other. Now, and this system works because it comes from private individuals, maximise utility, so it's all great. There's no externalities, everything's cool. Then along comes the government like a villain. You need the pantomime music, and the government emerges and puts on a coercive tax and said, you've got to give me some of your hard-earned cash so that we can waste it because we're the government and we act in our interest, not yours. Now, that's their view. I'm caricaturing. So in that world, it makes sense, isn't it? What you would do is, oh, no, all my purposeful individual work, some of my time has now been wasted. I have to work for the government. So I'm going to go at the government and I'm going to work just enough to do what the government needs me to do. And when I've finished, I'm going to come back to the private sector and wish the government wasn't there. I don't want any more of their useless money because we've got the proper actual money, as Byron calls it, the real gold stuff that's already pre-existing. Now, in his world, that makes sense. But in our world, it doesn't, because without the state, there is no money. So there is no bar development. It doesn't exist. It's in their imagination. So what happens is the state introduces the money. It monetizes society. And what people can see is, you imagine people work for the state, and what they find is they then get some money, and people think, well, I can't work for the state. I don't want to be a soldier. I will sell goods and services for state money from the people that do work for the government. So you might think, well, what I'm going to do is brew beer, and I'm going to brew beer, and I'm going to sell that to someone who wants to buy it so I can get my government taxes. Now, as you can see, people start to observe, don't you, all the goods and services that people are buying and selling in state money. And that's where the net savings is higher. If you lived in a world and people are paying taxes and people are also buying and selling stuff to get money to pay taxes, soon, I mean, it's embedded, it's natural. So, well, I want to buy some of that beer, so I'm going to sell something I do for state money to buy some beer, me too. So once people observe goods and services being sold for state money, they want to have more money than they have to pay in taxes.
So, while we're on the Austrian side of things, how they view money, what it is, I think a good way into understanding where they're coming from in terms of what is money is this part of the paper where you point out that Byland asks, why is government currency money? And then he argues, and I believe this is paraphrasing Ludwig von Mises' argument, which goes like this. A thing becomes money only by virtue of the fact that those exchanging commodities and services commonly use it as a medium of exchange. Actual money is accepted and exchanged because it is money. We would not expect economic actors to accept it in exchange for goods if it were not already money. That is before they knew or reasonably expected that others would accept it in exchange for goods. Again, as Mises puts it, a thing becomes money only by virtue of the fact that those exchanging commodities and services commonly use it as a medium of exchange. So this is my own interpretation. I'd say this is an attempt to define money by what it does rather than what it is, right?
Well, I mean, and you can see how that fits totally logically into their structure, doesn't it? It's saying that
money is money because it's money.
Well, money's a medium of exchange, but he doesn't explain how
it's not an explanation, is it?
Well, I mean, we could go on, how would people know something was a medium of exchange?
Yeah. Because they reasonably expect it is a medium of exchange. What?
I mean, there are lots of people, like Ingham and Frank Hahn, and people said, well, this concept of moneyness, it has to come from the outside. But their deepest, hardcore philosophy is the government is an outside and it's nefarious force. So if you said to an Austrian, what do you think about the state theory of money? Their first response is to think it's abhorrent. And I interviewed an Austrian who said that. So the idea that the money comes from the state is at first disgraceful to them. It can't. It's awful. It runs against everything believing. And then they will come with an alternative story. But this alternative story is conjectural history in the sense that they make it up. It's plausible, but it's not required to be supported by evidence, because they would argue, well, the evidence is there, you just haven't found it yet. If you go out and look hard enough, you'll find it. You don't need to, because it's self-evident that individuals, as we said, pursue self-interest if everyone's swapping and exchanging things. And bear in mind, they believe in this innate sense of people built in for truck and barter. It's a part of us, we want to do it, and therefore it has a certain appeal. So they go away and they find something that gets rid of the need to barter, this thing, this media exchange, and people then only accept things because it's already a medium exchange. So it's a very circular argument, like you said. But for them, it's very satisfactory, and it is satisfactory because it fits with their idea that individual acts in their self-interest, and it keeps the government out, which is where they want the government to be. And it's always categorised, as we say, some negative force on the system. And this, you can't get away from that. It's right in there hardcore, as I said. And because of that, you can't have, not to move too far away from the original point, but this is why I talk about this methodological incommensurability that we started the interview with, is that their view of the world is so different that you'll never really come to an agreement. You can have a valuable discussion, I would argue, with Austrian school economists, and it's valuable to learn where they're coming from. But given their view of the world is so different to ours, you can't really agree. But one thing I would say in favour of the Austrians is they do acknowledge uncertainty. They don't agree with ubiquitous mathematical modelling. And to be fair, their methodology is consistent and logical within itself. So it works for their imaginary world. And it sounds patronising. Whereas the mainstreamers are worse because they pretend that they are going to be deductivist and produce these theories which will then produce these things we can test. And then they don't accept falsification. At least the Austrians don't do that. They said that, well, our approach is true by definition. It's there. It's undeniable. Now you've got to go and work out how you're going to apply it to the real world. How does it fit? So that's what an Austrian school economist is doing. They're armed with their non-falsifiable theory, which follows direct from the methodology. Then they're thinking, how exactly does this fit? And shed light on what we can see. So it's a totally different approach. I don't agree with it, but at least I have more interest in it. I used to say the Austrians are interesting and wrong, whereas the mainstreamers are dull and wrong.
So that brings nicely to where I wanted to end up with this. And another thing that kind of goes along with your methodology that you've called deductivism is this thing called instrumentalism, which those of us that have been on the Modern Money Lab course will have studied in the first subject, which kind of comes from Milton Friedman's essay, which is called The F-Twist.
You know all about that one, Christian. I think you know more about that than me, that's for sure.
But euphemistically called The F-Twist by Samuelson, I believe, because this idea was so wacky, and it still is. And the more you look at it, the more you think, surely, obviously Friedman, very intelligent person, so I must have it wrong here, or there must be a way for me to tell this story to myself where it makes sense, as we've been attempting to do with the Austrian ideas. And the idea is basically that there's a short line from Friedman's essay that says that is basically, in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. And the idea is this is instrumentalism, that the assumptions in a model are instruments and they might be more or less useful for generating good predictions and strong predictions. And therefore, if they are unrealistic, but the model is predicting well, they're good assumptions to keep in the model. And that way we don't get bogged down in a lot, what's real and what's not real. We just get bogged down in what predicts well and what doesn't predict well. And you say, I'm going to put us to one side that Friedman actually, in a footnote on the same page of that essay, contradicts himself and basically says, I'm not saying here that a model must have unrealistic assumptions in it to be significant. And that's an asterisk at the bottom of the page. But it's like, no, that's exactly the opposite of what you've said in the main body of the text. And I cannot see how you've not said that. But anyway, that's in there, right? And a lot of these ideas that many new people and outsiders who come to orthodox economics kind of hear things like that and they think, well, I think people who are new to economics kind of bifurcate at this point. They kind of go, okay, well, obviously being an economist involves me being able to accept that thing, this ridiculous thing and explain it to somebody else. And other people kind of go, I think that's wrong. I think orthodox economics needs a bit of a severe upgrade. And that second group of people I would identify myself with. But anyway, so we come up against these things where we're like, how can that be right? And it persists for decades, this prevailing paradigm, in spite of loads and loads of anomalies. You said the financial crisis, the response to the financial crisis, which the mainstream orthodox thinkers said, oh, there's going to be hyperinflation because you're doing quantitative easing. And then there wasn't, interest rates went the other way. That's just the latest in a long line of anomalies in mainstream theory. Because we then go, all right, what is it going to take to break the mainstream paradigm? Because it's been broken over and over again as far as we can see, right? In your paper, you referenced Thomas Kuhn, right? Tell us about his ideas and why he's in there, because I think the answers are there.
Yeah. Well, Kuhn, he didn't really write much about economics, but ironically, the economists seem to be the ones who rather take it to his theory. What Kuhn was saying was, well, you got to really start with a guy called Popper, and Popper was really a deductivist. But what he was saying is that you have your theories, and they're based on axioms, and then you make predictions, and you must rigorously check your predictions of your model against reality. And if there is a weight of falsification, you have to swap to another theory. And in an ideal world, you would be able to specify the conditions under which you would accept falsification. Now, that basic model is the model that mainstream economists, if you ask them, that's what they'll say they do. They say, we have our abstract assumptions, we build models, and we test them against reality, and then it's reality decides what we do about the theory. And that's kind of what Friedman is advocating. The assumptions don't matter because any model's abstracted, because reality's so complicated, so we've all got abstract assumptions, so it's the proof of the pudding's in the eating. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that methodology. I don't think it's the best methodology, etc. But that's what they say they're going to do. Now, what Kuhn said was more to do with, well, let's have a look what scientists actually do in the real world. And what he was saying is that even though they say they will react to falsification and shift to another theory, in practice they hang on tenaciously to their own original theories because they've got a lot of vested interest, a lot of after recant and everything else. But it nevertheless is possible when there's a weight of evidence that really builds up. There's a period of what he calls revolutionary science where they'll chuck out the old theory and move into the new theory. Now, one could argue, like you said, well, surely if we look at the Kuhnian view of the world, that's what we need. We need this huge weight of evidence, which is there. Why haven't we got paradigm shift? Haven't we got enough evidence yet? And I would say that the real reason is that for there to be a paradigm shift, you need a weight of evidence, yes, but you need other things as well, particularly in economics. First of all, you need another theory which is well enough established to be an alternative. So when people leave the liner, they want to know there's a lifeboat to get into.
Can I just jump in and say, which is pretty much why we've got the neoliberal paradigm now, because Friedman and the Mont Pelerin Society kind of realized when the crisis strikes and people are looking around for a new paradigm, we've got to be there. We've just got to keep putting a load of tinder in the world so that when that spark comes along, it's our tinder that catches fire.
Yeah. And so you've got to have an alternative that's there. You've got to have like a political environment as well, which is conducive to the switch, like we had in the Second World War. Was after that, you had a desire for a different world than happened after the First World War. You had a Labour government and a Labour Party involved in wartime experience and planning. People thought that there could be a different world. So you needed broad acceptance amongst ordinary people, for want of a better phrase, that there is another way, that Thatcher was wrong, there's no alternative. There is an alternative, and you need a theory that seems like a real alternative. But unfortunately, at the moment, the mainstream have collared all the journals and the way of thinking so much that there isn't any sort of real feeling there's an alternative out there. That's why we're trying to put MMT out there. Now, Austrian school, if we were talking about that, I don't really class them as mainstream. I mean, they have certain things in common with mainstream, but I don't think they would class themselves. But in a way, they want to move the world the wrong way. So, in a sense, they have critiques of the mainstream, although they've got aspects in common with them. But they want to move the world a different direction to the progressives, who want like more of a sense that the state has bigger responsibilities and can do things. But so that's the problem. Kuhn's, I think, is right. We've never quite hit critical mass. We're still working on it. I mean, the paradigm wobbled a bit in the financial crisis, and it wobbled a bit with COVID, when people saying, oh, where's the government getting all that money? But the tower hasn't fallen. Those people that have seen the last thing in The Lord of the Rings with Sauron's tower, and it collapses. It hasn't quite got to that point. It's wobbled a touch. And that's what we're all doing. You and Patricia and the Gims, we're all trying to wobble that tower a bit more. But it's a hard battle because the people who are in control of the tower are in control of the Death Star, which is another analogy we use.
Yeah, we have to put these references in because our friend Mark will be listening and it will really annoy him.
Yeah, he won't like that. And Patricia will think, what are these? Once I let them go to Star Trek last time, what are they doing now? So in a way, we just got to keep working. And the problem, I think, is that with science, it's really hard to get paradigm shift. There's no question of that. But with economics, it's even worse because you've got the politics and the money. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's natural. If you're doing really well out of the current paradigm, if you're rich and powerful, etc., if you're in the ruling classes, and I am veering a bit towards my Marxist sympathies there, you're doing really well. So you don't even want to consider another paradigm, and you've got the power. So it's natural, isn't it, if you're doing well?
In a way, what you've just said kind of rhymes with what we just said about the Austrian worldview, is that these incentives matter, right?
Yeah, oh, very much.
The self-interest thing does count for something.
You're absolutely right. And for the Austrians, this idea of entrepreneurs and individuals, that's their core thing, that there are people who can think of great ideas and innovate and make the world great, and the government is to free up and we move forward into a free market utopia. And what makes it difficult, as we've said already, is those that are advocating for a different view of the world and saying, states do issue money and states have the capability to make the world better. We're always, like, in a sense, brought down a bit by the fact the quality of the governments we've got, as we've said many times, are so poor. So that gives the Austrians quite a lot of, you're arguing, we should have a job guarantee and the government should be making sure that because they've caused, but what are they going to do? And then you bring up the sorts of governments we've had, Trump, Johnson, etc. And then you're going, because and that's the problem, that we just would like, if we had a really good government, inverted commas, and I accept that's somewhat subjective, who understood MMT and the theoretical insights of MMT, how it explains the world properly, then that said good government could bring those insights to bear. But we haven't got that on the horizon. So that's the main problem, along with all the others.
So, in a way, that's where we can say that you can meet the Austrian mindset if you're not an Austrian economist, is that I think we probably all accept that governance is not necessarily good just because it's government. And I think we all totally agree with that sentiment. And I would say our solution is, okay, good governance is something we desire, whereas the Austrians will be like, no governance or minimal governance is what we desire. And it's okay to have that tension, I think, between the two parties. And again, I think what we would say, which might be argued against via the Austrian school, is we're saying governance is almost inevitable. Like, it's very hard to develop flat hierarchical structures, I think, at the scale that we have nations. The answer to that might be, well, do away with nations, do away with but it's like, okay, but now we're looking at a very big project here. And what we're trying to do as MMT is go, look, we have this thing called a modern money system in our parlance, and this is how it works, and what's a functional way to run it. And we've got a sort of near-term sort of aspiration to shoot for, which is true full employment. And another way that we could maybe bring this closer to something that an Austrian might agree with is we could define that true full employment as people are working a lot less generally. A standard job is not a 40-hour week. It's a 30-hour week or a 20-hour week. There's lots more time for non-state provisioning activity now, and a lot more time to think about what would be a better way forward. But in the absence of lots and lots of cooperative structures, literal cooperatives or unions, doing away with the state, pretty much what would take going from where we are now rather than from where we'd like to be. I think what this power structure that takes over at that point is going to be conglomerations of private wealth and power, huge corporations. You're going to see, I don't know, muck government, basically. And I think there's a better way to get to a greater level of freedom for the individual. I don't think it's via muck government.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, although I enjoy talking to us, I mean, in the world of economics, a lot of it is to do with the personalities of the people. I wouldn't like in any way to say the Austrians aren't nice people. I mean, I interviewed a guy called Kevin Dowd. I think I mentioned it earlier. He's a really lovely guy. He's an Austrian school. We had a great fish and chip supper together. We agreed on certain things. On others, obviously, we had massive disagreements. And the interview's in my book. I'm sounding like a plug in my book. But I really enjoyed it and I learned something from it. And although, to be fair, I don't agree with much of the stuff Per Bylan puts in, he does actually put forward questions that need answering, like why is there a net savings desire? And I hope in this podcast with yourself, we've answered that question. So he's put the question out there. So engagement from the Austrian school is valuable. And if you get polite people, which goes back to Dow's heuristics, your first question, if we engage with the Austrians politely, not in sound bites, and try and understand where they're coming from, that's got to be a good thing. And obviously their politics is about as different to mine as imaginable. Their economics, to me, describes a world that doesn't exist, although it does it fairly elegantly and it's moderately interesting. And they'd probably say the same about MMT. I mean, but the Austrians have been around a long time, particularly in the US now. This no government is becoming a big deal out there in certain areas. So it's no surprise that the Austrian school is gaining a lot of traction. And it's just another school, really. You've got the Austrians and then, of course, the monetarists who have got a different methodology in some ways, but still believe in a small government. And then, of course, the other heterodox schools who have something in common with MMT, but don't always get on. So it's a complicated world out there, Christian.
It is a complicated world, but I think we've uncovered one incontrovertible truth in this interview, which is a fish and chip supper is the way to go.
Yes.
If you're having a bit of a disagreement,
yes,
with a school of thought that doesn't necessarily align with your own, I think more fish and chip suppers.
Fish and chips, a glass of beer, and if it's a fine day, everyone seems to get on. But there we are. If only we could do that the world over. An awful lot there, on it, Christian.
Great stuff. That's a great place to leave it. I've been talking to Phil Armstrong. I'll link to all things Phil in the show notes for this episode, including to where you can get hold of Phil's books. The one that he referenced earlier was Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference? And that contains an interview with the Austrian economist in question. And there are also lots of papers by Phil, which are very illuminating, and many that we've talked about on this show. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and heterodox economics to the next level, Modern Money Lab is running online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the cream of MMT lecturers. So there's a link to more about that in the show notes. Finally, for our Patreon subscribers, there's a link to all our patron-only episodes. Check out the show notes for all of the above. But for now, thank you once again so much for joining me today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
It's been great to be with you, Christian.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.